Okay, we're recording. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, indeed.
It's Monday with Jesus. Well, except actually, we're not coming to you on Monday, actually, because we're doing this a little ahead of time because we're going on a trip to visit children and sisters. Hallelujah. But anyway, here we are with another story from the Passion, Death, and Resurrection narrative, according to the Gospel of Mark. And today's story is about Jesus' death, crucifixion and death. So Tom will tell us the story.
So this is our invitation to remember. They compelled a passerby, one Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they carried him to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mingled with myrrh, but he didn't take it. And they crucified him, divided his garments among them by throwing dice on them to see what each one would get. It was the third hour, and they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two insurrectionists, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by blasphemed against him and derided him, saying, "Hey, you who would tear down the temple in 3 days and build up another one, not made with hands, come down now from the cross that we might see and believe." The chief priests and the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross so that we might see and believe." And even those who were crucified with him reviled him. Now at the 6th hour, a deep darkness descended over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani." And that means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" One of those who was standing there heard this and said, he's calling Elijah. And running and filling a sponge full of sour wine, he put it on a stick and held it up to him to drink, saying, "Well, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down." But Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the centurion, when he who was standing opposite him, when he saw how he died, he said, "Truly this man was Son of God." And there were women who were watching from a distance. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Younger and Joseph, and Salome, who had been with him in Galilee and had traveled with him and served him, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So the story has a whole lot of details in it. The first one is about this person, Simon of Cyrene. I don't think we've heard about him previously.
No.
Yeah. What's the implication of the fact that he carried the cross?
Well, first, in terms of his identity, Cyrene was the region of now Libya. So he was an African who apparently had land near Jerusalem because it said that he was coming in from the fields. And the reason that they compelled him to carry Jesus' cross is that Jesus couldn't carry it anymore. It was the Roman custom that they would carry their own cross it would be the cross beam. But the implication is that Jesus was too weakened by the flogging so that he couldn't carry the cross.
So they crucified him at the third hour. What time would that be?
Well, that would have been 9 o'clock. So the trial began at 6, and then the trip out to Golgotha and the mocking and all the things that had taken place were, the implication is 3 hours. That's the crucifixion happened sometime around 9 o'clock.
Okay. And they put an inscription over him, King of the Jews. Was that common to have an inscription over a person who was crucified? And what,
Often.
Why was that the charge? And what was the significance of that?
Well, that was what Pilate, questioned him, and was the charge that the chief priests had brought. And that was a charge that was implication of sedition, of trying to overthrow the government and to establish Jesus as the king. So in the implication was that this was a political crime, which was also indicated by both crucifixion, which was often reserved for crimes against the state, and by the fact that they crucified 2 insurrectionists with him. Though the word that in Greek that is used there is leistes, which Josephus regularly uses for the various factions of the revolt in 66. That would have been very present in the minds of Mark's listeners in the early 70s in the aftermath of the war.
And then you have a little section about various persons, passerbys, I think, and the chief priests and scribes. Well, even the people who were the 2 men, I guess, one on each side, who were crucified with him, mocking him, reviling him. Why are they so hostile towards Jesus? I mean, it's bad enough. I mean, he's being executed, tortured, killed. They it's like, salt on the wound, as you'd say.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Well, the implication for the passers-by, that is for the residents of Jerusalem and so on who were passing by, that their mockery of him was of one who claimed to be the Messiah, but who was nonviolent and who didn't, instigate a revolution. And so they were mocking him as a fraud, and that his pretensions to being Messiah were resulted in than this totally humiliating crucifixion. And for those who were crucified with him, that they were making fun of him because he was nonviolent and was a joke as a revolutionary.
Yeah, it is like the scorn that people who are pacifists get, he's being unrealistic, and here it's proven he's being executed. So his leadership is, what's that amounted to? Nothing in their eyes. Yeah,
right.
That makes sense. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Understandable cry of despair in that moment, especially when it appears that nobody's listened to him at all. Nobody's cares about his message. Is there does that cry mean anything other than just total despair? What do we know about that?
Yes, it does. It's the first line, the first cola of Psalm 22, which is is probably the classic Israelite song of a righteous sufferer who, in the midst of the suffering, experiences God as having abandoned him. And so it is. It's a song that details the sufferings. Wild bulls of Bashan surround me. They mock me. So it's a song that was sung. The end of the song is very positive. So some have proposed that he's, remembering the whole song, but what he's effectively, cries out is out of a sense of abandonment, and that it also implies that his experience was that God had forsaken him.
Yeah, well, I actually didn't know the answer to that question. But so I want to confess that, because I want to tell a little bit about this story about that. One Lent, I did this series of stories with women incarcerated in a state prison. And when it came to this story, I was explaining, that this was Jesus' cry was this Psalm 22. And said, would anybody like to read Psalm 22? And this woman volunteered, and she stood up. I was just going to have her read, the first part of that, but she read the whole thing. And it was so beautiful and so profound to hear where that song goes. As you mentioned, it goes to a positive place. It begins in a place of despair. And it's almost like that this is what's happening in Jesus' life, looking toward the resurrection, but also perhaps, yes, he was in a place of despair. And so this psalm comes to his mind. And, in my mind, he's going to go through the whole psalm. But anyway, just the memory of this woman in this prison, a place of a whole lot of despair. Oh my goodness. And they would talk about that, but that the way she stood up and so beautifully read this psalm. It was a very striking moment of, for me, the presence of the kingdom of God in that place.
Well, that's there's a lot of, there's a lot of evidence that many of the people who became followers of Jesus in the late first century were slaves. And in every major Roman city, there was a concession outside the walls, a little business that where owners of slaves could have a slave crucified for, like a quarter or 50 cents. And so the people who most frequently were crucified were slaves. And so they identified with Jesus as one who was a sign of God's presence with them, and that they were not abandoned. So they were drawn to Jesus.
Yeah. Okay, so then now we get a detail about somebody offering wine to Jesus. Tell us what that was about, and also why they said wait. Why did somebody stop them?
Right. Well, the evidence, people who have investigated, the actual physical things that happen with crucifixion, is that on the one hand, people die from not being able to breathe, that they, hanging on a cross, that they finally run out of breath. But the other thing is that they die from thirst. And so the implication of this is that this person at the foot of the cross knew that, and was thought that Jesus was calling for Elijah, and so was giving him some sour wine, which was the preferred beverage, was the one thing that soldiers could afford. So the Romans would have had some sour wine there. So he put it on to give him something to drink so he'd live a little longer, and then give Elijah more of a chance to come and save him. So it was another taunting of Jesus by this person at the foot of the cross. It also is reminiscent, and we didn't mention that, but that Jesus was offered wine mingled with myrrh before he was crucified. He didn't take it, and this is that brings to mind his vow at the Last Supper, at the Passover. Truly, I tell you, never again will I drink of the fruit of the vine until I drink it new in the kingdom of God. So it's a vow vows like that, vows of abstinence, were taken by soldiers before battle. So the implication is that Jesus kept his vow.
Kept his vow, even in the face of very strong temptation.
Right. Both before,
right,
just before he was crucified, and now at the last minute before he died.
Right.
That he cried out. He didn't take this wine, even though thirst was
severe.
Tortured.
Right, yeah. Right, kind of torture, right. Well, when he dies, the curtain is torn in two. And what does that? Somebody forgot to turn their phone off.
Yeah.
Okay, what does that curtain being torn in two signify? Well,
the classic symbol of grief, and it's expressed in this story. The the high priest, when Jesus says, "I am," in response to this question, "Are you the Messiah?" He says, "I am." The high priest rent his garments. He tore his clothes. And that was a sign of grief. People did that when they heard the news that a family member had died, or when some great tragedy had taken place in the family. They would rend their garments. They would tear their clothes. So the rending of the temple curtain is first of all a sign of grief. And it is, by implication,
whose grief, Tom?
God's grief.
Ah, okay.
That God had not abandoned him, that God grieved Jesus' death at the moment of his death, and that he was present with him in this trial, and in this crucifixion.
So right after Jesus dies, there's really God's response is the first of three responses. Then you have the centurion. Who's a centurion, and what's the significance of what he says about Jesus? Truly, this is the Son of God. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, well, the centurion was in the Roman army the sergeant. He was in charge of 100 men. He was the officer, and so this centurion would have been in charge of the group that carried out the crucifixion. So he was carrying out the orders then of Pontius Pilate of the crucifixion. So he would have been watching to see that everything was done according to those orders. So the centurions were the tough guys of the Roman army. They had been through battle. They won their position as an officer by being by valor in battle. And so this centurion, the epitome of the enemy of Israel, when he saw how Jesus died, his courage, his strength, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. And Son of God was a term that was used for emperors. So Julius Caesar was named a son of God. Augustus had been named by the Roman Senate, Son of God. So for him to call Jesus Son of God was both the greatest name of respect that he could have named. It was also, by implication, that he in some sense believed in Jesus as God.
Fine.
And as one who he saw as being truly a son of God. So it's a really, in the story, it's a really big deal that the character of Jesus' death had this kind of power, that it would change the mind of the executioner.
Yeah. Wow. And then there's the women.
Yep.
Do we know? Well, they are named, aren't they?
Well, 3 of them are named.
Okay.
Who are the implication is that there were no men there. The men had all run away. Yeah. So the only ones of Jesus' followers who were present were the women. They could do that. They were not in danger of being arrested. But the implication is that they were the ones who grieved him for him, that they mourned him. And
they did stay with him through his time of greatest agony.
Right. The only one of them who is by implication named earlier in the story is in the story of Jesus preaching in the synagogue in Nazareth. They say, isn't this Mary's son? And aren't his brothers James and Joseph and Simon here with us? So the name is Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and Joseph, And James the younger is James the younger, by implication, the younger brother. Well, the implication is that Mark is alluding to this being Jesus' mother, who was watching from a distance, and Salome. That these three women had been with him in Galilee and had served him, and then many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem from Galilee.
Yeah, it's interesting too that hearing the story told as you've done, and then ending with this, these witnesses of these women, we almost become as if like we're with the women watching this happen, and it's nothing like what their experience would have been, but there's a kind of pain and presence just in our hearing the story told in this way. At least that was my experience as I listened to you tell it. And now as I think about the women watching from a distance. So I guess that's partly a pitch for you all out there to learn the story and tell it to your congregations or you know, just to anyone. This is what happened with Jesus. I hope you have a good week. You want to say something, Tom?
Well,
Last words.
The story is an occasion for self-examination. The implication is that every listener was invited to recognize the degree to which they were implicated in the things that led to Jesus' death, and specifically the choice of Barabbas, an insurrectionist, to choose the way of war rather than the way of peace, and that Jesus was then the Messiah of peace, and that recognizing our own involvement in in what led to that, we'd reflect on that.
Yeah,
and
right.
So it's an invitation to and
because we might find ourselves more often in the position of the passerbys or even the chief priests mocking Jesus because he wouldn't advocate in going to war. I mean, think what it's like in these days if your country, is all gung-ho to go against war, which we've done many times. And sometimes it feels like for a very righteous cause, but think of what if those who say it's wrong to go to war, we should deal with our conflicts in some other way. Think how they're often treated and how we feel about them.
It's a story about a Messiah of peace.
Yeah.
A Messiah of nonviolence, and of God, and that this also is a sign of God's way of saving us as human beings from war, from conflict, as a solution to our problems.
Right. Okay.
Believe.
That's it for this week. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.